In this episode, we're going to talk about one of the most delicate parts of security governance: what to do when someone cannot meet a policy requirement and asks for an exception or a waiver. On paper, policies often look like firm boundaries, but in real operations there are deadlines, legacy systems, emergencies, and business constraints that sometimes make perfect compliance impossible in the short term. The danger is that if exceptions are handled casually, the policy slowly dissolves into a suggestion because every new exception becomes a precedent. The other danger is that if exceptions are never allowed, teams will create unofficial workarounds, which are usually riskier and harder to detect than controlled exceptions. The goal is to handle exceptions in a way that respects operational reality without sacrificing the protective outcomes the policy exists to ensure. That means exceptions must be deliberate, limited, measurable, and accountable, so they do not quietly erode control effectiveness over time. For beginners, this matters because exceptions are where governance meets pressure, and pressure reveals whether the program is mature or performative. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. First, it helps to define what we mean by an exception and what we mean by a waiver, because the language shapes how people treat the request. An exception is typically a temporary, bounded permission to deviate from a policy requirement under specific conditions, usually because immediate compliance is not feasible. A waiver is often treated as a more formal permission, sometimes longer-lasting, to operate without meeting a requirement, usually with documented justification and acceptance of risk. Different organizations use these terms differently, but the key idea is the same. Both are controlled deviations, not silent bypasses. Controlled deviation means the organization explicitly acknowledges that the standard is not being met, understands the risk created by that gap, and takes steps to reduce or monitor that risk. If any of those elements are missing, the deviation becomes uncontrolled, and uncontrolled deviations are how policies lose their meaning. A beginner misunderstanding is to think exceptions are simply favors granted to keep work moving. But in governance, exceptions are risk decisions that must be handled with the same seriousness as any other risk decision. When exceptions are treated as risk decisions, they can exist without destroying the policy system. The reason exceptions can erode control effectiveness is that policies are designed to create consistent behavior, and consistency is what makes controls reliable. When exceptions become frequent, teams stop believing the requirement is real, and they start assuming they can negotiate it away whenever it is inconvenient. Over time, the organization accumulates a patchwork of special cases, and the control becomes uneven, with some areas protected and others exposed. This unevenness increases risk because attackers and failures tend to find the weakest path, and exceptions often create exactly those weak paths. Exceptions also create operational complexity because people must remember which systems or teams are operating under which rules, and that complexity causes mistakes. The goal is not to eliminate every exception. The goal is to prevent exceptions from becoming a parallel policy system that overrides the real one. A mature program keeps exceptions rare, bounded, and visible, so the standard remains the standard. When exceptions are handled well, they become part of governance rather than a threat to governance. A strong exceptions process begins with a clear threshold for when an exception is allowed, because not every inconvenience qualifies as a valid reason to deviate from a requirement. If the organization grants exceptions for minor discomfort, it teaches people to ask rather than to adapt. On the other hand, if the threshold is too strict or unclear, people will bypass the process entirely. A reasonable threshold often includes criteria like inability to comply due to technical constraints, conflict with critical business operations, or urgent circumstances where waiting would cause harm. The process should require the requester to explain why compliance is not feasible right now, what would be required to become compliant, and what timeline could realistically achieve compliance. This is important because many exception requests are really requests for more time, not requests to abandon the requirement forever. When you force the conversation into feasibility and timeline, you reduce the chance that exceptions become permanent by accident. You also reveal whether the real issue is lack of resources, unclear procedures, or misunderstanding of the requirement. That insight helps improve governance overall. Once an exception request is raised, the organization needs a consistent way to assess risk, because risk assessment is what determines whether the deviation is acceptable and what safeguards are needed. Risk assessment here does not need to be complex, but it must be honest about what protection is being lost and what consequences could follow. This is where guiding principles help, because you can connect the requirement to the outcome it protects, such as preventing unauthorized access or preserving evidence. The risk assessment should consider how likely the harm is, how large the harm could be, and what compensating controls might reduce the risk while the exception exists. Compensating controls are alternative protections that partially or fully offset the risk created by the exception, such as increased monitoring, temporary restrictions, or additional approvals. The key is that compensating controls must be realistic and enforceable, or they become paper promises. For beginners, think of this as keeping the intent of the policy intact even when the exact requirement cannot be met temporarily. The exception should not remove protection entirely. It should shift protection in a controlled way. A critical part of preserving control effectiveness is making exceptions time-bound, because time-bound exceptions create pressure to return to the standard instead of drifting indefinitely. If an exception has no expiration, it becomes the new normal, and the organization forgets that it is out of compliance. Time-bound does not mean arbitrary. It means the exception has a clear review date or end date tied to a remediation plan. The remediation plan should specify what must change to eliminate the exception, who owns that work, and what progress will be tracked. This turns the exception into a temporary bridge rather than a permanent loophole. It also creates a natural moment for reevaluation, because conditions may change, resources may be allocated, or the risk may become more severe. When the review date arrives, the organization can decide to close the exception, extend it with new justification, or escalate the issue if progress has stalled. This discipline keeps exceptions from quietly undermining standards. Accountability is equally important, because exceptions are decisions, and decisions must have owners. A mature exceptions process makes clear who can approve an exception, who accepts the risk on behalf of the organization, and who is responsible for implementing compensating controls and remediation. Approval should align with authority, meaning the approver must have the power to accept the consequences if the exception leads to harm. This is why exceptions often require sign-off from leadership, especially for high-impact risks, because operational teams should not be forced to carry risk decisions that belong at higher levels. Accountability also includes evidence, meaning the exception decision, the justification, the compensating controls, and the expiration date should be recorded in a way that can be reviewed later. This record is not about blame. It is about governance integrity. If an incident occurs, the organization needs to know whether the risk was known, whether it was accepted consciously, and whether safeguards were in place. Clear accountability makes exceptions safer because it discourages casual approvals and encourages thoughtful mitigation. Transparency is another protective element, because exceptions that are hidden tend to multiply and become inconsistent. Transparency does not mean broadcasting every exception to everyone, but it does mean maintaining visibility for the people responsible for governance and risk oversight. When governance leaders can see the exception landscape, they can identify patterns, such as repeated exceptions in a particular workflow, which may indicate that the policy or procedure is unrealistic. They can also identify cumulative risk, because many small exceptions can add up to a large exposure. Transparency supports fairness too, because teams are less likely to feel singled out when they know exceptions are handled consistently and based on criteria rather than on favoritism. It also reduces the chance that exceptions are used as stealth ways to bypass controls. If the process is visible and consistent, stakeholders are more likely to use it properly rather than working around it. Over time, transparency helps the organization learn, because exceptions become data about where the system needs improvement. Another important practice is to limit the scope of exceptions as much as possible, because broad exceptions create broad risk. A well-handled exception is specific about what is being waived, for what system, for what time period, and under what conditions. It should not be vague like this team is exempt, because team-level exemptions often become permanent and hard to manage. It also should not waive more than necessary, because unnecessary waiver expands exposure without providing additional operational benefit. Scope discipline keeps the standard strong because it ensures the exception is truly a special case rather than a blanket policy change. It also makes remediation easier because the exception is attached to a defined target that can be brought back into compliance. For beginners, it helps to think of exceptions like controlled leaks in a boat, where you want the leak to be small, visible, and reparable, rather than a hidden crack that grows. The more precise the exception, the more likely it is that control effectiveness remains high across the rest of the environment. Exceptions should also be measured, because measurement is how you ensure exceptions do not silently erode the program. Meaningful indicators here include the number of active exceptions, the duration of exceptions, the reasons exceptions are requested, and whether remediation plans are progressing. If exceptions are increasing, that is a signal that either the policy is unrealistic, the organization is under-resourced, or enforcement is inconsistent. If exceptions persist past expiration, that is a signal that accountability is weak or that remediation is not prioritized. If certain teams repeatedly request exceptions for the same requirement, that is a signal that the procedure or guidelines supporting the policy may not fit their operational reality. Measurement makes these patterns visible and actionable. It also supports executive decision-making, because leaders can see where risk is being accepted repeatedly and decide whether to invest in fixes. Without measurement, exceptions become invisible debt that accumulates until it causes a major failure. A beginner misunderstanding is to see exceptions as inherently bad, but exceptions can be a sign of a healthy governance system when they are handled correctly. A healthy system acknowledges reality, provides a controlled path for temporary deviation, and uses that path to learn and improve. What makes exceptions harmful is not their existence but their unmanaged nature, where they are granted casually, left open indefinitely, and treated as private deals rather than governed decisions. When exceptions are governed, they can reduce risk compared to informal workarounds, because at least the deviation is known, bounded, and mitigated. The key is to ensure the exception does not become the easy path for avoiding discomfort. The standard must remain the default, and the exception must feel like a special, justified case with explicit obligations. This is why empathetic resistance handling matters, because you can acknowledge constraints while still defending the non-negotiable protective outcome. Exceptions are part of that balance when managed properly. As we close, handling exceptions and waivers without eroding control effectiveness is about maintaining the integrity of the policy system while respecting operational reality. A mature exceptions process uses clear thresholds, consistent risk assessment, realistic compensating controls, time bounds, explicit accountability, scoped approvals, transparency, and measurement. These elements ensure that deviations are controlled and temporary rather than casual and permanent, and they turn exceptions into a learning signal rather than a governance failure. For exam thinking, look for answers that emphasize controlled risk acceptance, documentation, compensating safeguards, and time-limited approvals, because those are the hallmarks of mature policy governance. In the real world, the organization that handles exceptions well is the organization that can move quickly without losing control, because it can adapt under pressure while still protecting core outcomes. That is what effective governance looks like: flexible where it can be, firm where it must be, and always honest about what risk is being accepted and why.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.